We're here today with Father Anthony Cicada, and part of our continuing series of interviews with Father on various traditionalist topics. Today we're going to talk about the episcopal consecrations of Archbishop Noding Took, which have been controversial in some quarters, questioned in some quarters, but Father has written quite a bit on this, and obviously works with someone here on a daily basis who derives from that episcopal line. So he has a interest in this. Father, how did you first come to be involved in even researching the Took consecrations, and weren't you at one time completely opposed?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, first of all, we had heard about these consecrations being performed, and we wondered what to make of them. At that time, I believe we were in the Pius X Society, and I ended up researching the history and the different characters involved. But one of the questions in my mind was, how did one determine, according to the principles of Catholic sacramental theology and according to the principles of canon law, whether or not an episcopal consecration was valid? Because obviously that's the question, that's the issue. Are these real bishops capable of producing real priests? For us at that point, it was, I suppose, a somewhat theoretical issue, because I believe we were in the Pius X Society at that point. But that was the question. I wasn't able to resolve that initially. After we left the Pius X Society, naturally there was the question of what would we do for the future to ensure that we would have a future generation of priests who would work with us and who would take care of our people. There were attempts to contact and to interest different older bishops who were retired, working with us. None of these were really successful.
And where did you get these names? Was there a list of, people who were
Bishop with
secretly...
lots to do, with a lot of time on his hands. Bishops that you had heard were somewhat conservative and sympathetic to traditional causes, and you'd think that maybe one of these men would be interested in it. Well, that ended up being really a dead end, because none of them were interested. Then there was the question of Bishop Antonio de Castro Meyer, of course, down in Campos in Brazil. So then Father Sanborn went down to visit him to see if he could interest de Castro Meyer in helping us out. The general reputation that de Castro Meyer had at that point was someone who was more of a hardliner on the question of the Pope, as we were, and we'd hope we might interest him. Well,
What year was this about?
it was after our departure from the Pius X Society, so it would have been possibly 84.
But it was before 88.
Yes, it was before 88. So Bishop Sanborn had, then Father Sanborn had some very good discussions with de Castro Meyer. He found he was very easy to talk with and to even argue with over different theological questions, and he had a very good time doing that, was very well received. He asked Bishop de Castro Meyer, well, what should we do? We need someone to provide priests for us, and apparently you're not willing to work outside of your diocese. And he told Father Sanborn, go to Gerard de Laurier, who had been, of course, consecrated bishop by Archbishop Took. And de Castro Meyer's point to Bishop Sanborn was that obviously this is valid if Gerard de Laurier, who is a prominent theologian in some circles, if he got involved, you shouldn't have any fear on that count. So Bishop Sanborn brought this word to us back in the United States, and naturally it was somewhat controversial. and the group of priests that we had, 9, then 12 priests, we debated this back and forth.
Some of you had Bishop Gerard Delorier as a seminary professor, did
Yes,
you not?
yes, we did. Bishop Sanborn did, Bishop Dolan did, I did, Father Jenkins did. Some of the other fathers may have had him as a professor as well.
You were personally acquainted with him also.
Yes, you knew who he was, and he was a devout and highly intelligent man. He certainly was someone who was recognized as a theologian. So he, in terms of someone who had credibility, he certainly had a great deal of credibility. But in any event, we decided that we would investigate this question of the consecrations that Archbishop Tuck had performed. Now, we had heard that there were no consecration certificates. We had heard that there were photos of the consecration. We were wondering what was sufficient. To balance the research and to balance the discussion, 2 of us undertook the question of researching the issues here for the rest of the priests. Then Father Sanborn took the pro-tuck involvement, as it were, the pro-validity position, and I took the anti, because I was very much opposed to having anything to do with any of the bishops that he had consecrated.
Why is that, Father?
Well, it was, a number of them were, let's put it this way, real characters. They were people that, we would not really have chosen to work with. Some of them, the Mexican bishop, Bishop Carmona, was someone that we didn't really know too much about, I suppose. But, there was a slight prejudice against him because some of the people that he had consecrated. In any event, Bishop Sanborn did his research, I did my research. And what I discovered is that there were no special rules for ascertaining the validity of an episcopal consecration.
And where were you looking, Father?
I worked my way through several libraries. The Jesuit University Library, Marquette University, St. John's in New York. I went to also Fordham University. And whenever I'd get in a city with a Catholic library, I'd go and try to look up material on this. So
this is way back before the internet.
Way back before the internet, when you actually had to look up things on paper, which was tremendously inconvenient. In any event, I read my way through an awful lot of canon law treatises and really found that there was nothing in this regard that one could look to say that there were special requirements. In any event, the Bishop Sanborn had also researched the issue, and he had come up with the same thing that I did. There are no special requirements. The other priests in the organization had raised questions, well, what about Tuck's intention, etc. And Bishop Sanborn found a number of passages that, address that one is a minister of a sacrament who uses a Catholic rite is presumed to have the correct intention. So if you have a Catholic minister and he performs a Catholic rite, he's presumed to have the correct intention. Now, the reason we had to go down all of these routes is because, as far as we knew, Monsignor Tuck had not issued certificates for the episcopal consecrations that he performed. So we were sort of looking for an alternative to that, because obviously you want to be certain. In any event, at one of the meetings, Bishop Sanborn presented some material he had found from Apostolicae Curiae in Leo XIII about intention that I found particularly convincing, and that sort of pushed me over the edge to regard them as valid. So that's the deep background, as it were, to how I got involved in this particular issue.
So you were supposed to play devil's advocate, and you ended up being an angel.
Yeah. I depending on who you talk to, of course, but I certainly ended up being converted on the question.
So how did this take with the other, I guess, 11? Well, other than Bishop Sanborn, the other 10 priests.
Well, I mean.
Did you have a meeting and present everybody?
Yeah, some were, some continued, to be against. At least at that point, said there wasn't enough proof or enough evidence. So there was a great deal of going back and forth on it. Eventually, after I left the Pius V Society, I had time to research a major article on it, the validity of the Took consecrations, which we circulated as a booklet, which we put on the internet.
It's on traditionalmass.org.
Traditionalmass.org, that's correct. And that addressed most of the major objections that had been made to that point. And I cited, chapter and verse from different theologians and canonists and popes to deal with the different objections that had been made. And then having gone through all of this work and all of this research, because there were apparently no consecration certificates that Took had issued, I was talking with Bishop Mark Pivarunas once, and he said, "Oh, I have the certificate of consecration that he issued for Bishop Carmona." So the day after Bishop Carmona's episcopal consecration, Took had written out in Latin, in correct Latin, a certificate of episcopal consecration. So from the point of view of if one wanted a certificate, well, there it was.
So this is sort of the high school diploma, sort of.
Yes, that's right. And if you questioned anything else,
or a celebret for a priest.
Yes,
you have some kind of paper proof.
There's a paper proof for it, even though there were photos. And the priest who had opposed the idea of any involvement with bishops who derived their orders from Archbishop Took, this had been their major objection. Well, there's no certificate. Well, there's a certificate.
And then what?
Well, then they found other reasons to say that they wanted nothing to do with priests or clergy who derived their orders from Archbishop Took. But eventually most of the priests in the group, the 12 who had left the Society of St. Pius X, were won over in the argument. I believe 9 out of 12.
Okay.
So they eventually came to find the article and the arguments quite convincing.
And the rest have resisted till present day, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. Resisted and not recognized, but that's another issue.
Of course, I think this is somewhat timely. Mario Dirksen wrote a very long letter. It's on tookbishops.com, the internet. It's over 100 pages. I think, quite well written. But
Germans tend to be very thorough,
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Heiner. Yes.
This is known. So obviously we don't have time to get into all 100 pages, and I think you've touched on a lot of what Mario went into much deeper detail to talk about in his letter. But I suppose what we might do is sort of bring us to current day, along with Mario's summary, which is we know via photos, via certificate of consecration, that the consecrations actually did happen.
Mm-hmm.
That we know that they're valid, not only from us thinking that, well, Bishop Gerard de Laurier is very learned,
Mm-hmm.
he would know, but from looking at research yourself, finding out how a consecration would be valid and how it's judged by the church. Then the question is about, are the consecrations lawful? And obviously this is sort of a gray area given where we are currently in the state of the church. So can you speak to that a little bit, Father? When we say that the consecrations are lawful, what does that mean?
Well, normally what you would have in church law would be the provision that an episcopal consecration could not be conferred without a papal document called an apostolic mandate. So,
but that's fairly new in church law.
That is. It's fairly new in church law. But it exists nevertheless. It existed nevertheless. The answer to your question is tied into the question of how do traditional Catholics justify their sacramental ministry, conferring and receiving sacraments without fulfilling all the different prerequisites of canon law, of church law. And the general answer to that question is those are provisions of church law, but we're in a situation now where the sacraments are needed, and the priests who do not have the requisite permissions to function in different parts of the country to confer different sacraments have the obligation, nevertheless, under divine law and in virtue of their ordination, to go ahead and to confer those sacraments. That's a clear principle in sacramental moral theology, that when the clergy who normally would have the obligation, the pastors and the diocesan bishops, to confer sacraments, are not doing it for whatever reason, the clergy who do not have that particular assignment of pastoral care then have the obligation to step in. And so that generally is what traditional priests were doing. And so in the case of a priest who, let us say, does not have permission to perform baptisms, which would be normally required for him when times were normal in the church, he would have the obligation now to confer baptisms on Catholics who maintain the faith. So too for bishops, because of the question of the validity of the new ordination rites and the heterodoxy of the modern seminaries, those Catholic bishops who have retained the faith, such as Archbishop Tooke or Archbishop Lefebvre, had not only the right but had the obligation to pass on the priesthood and the episcopacy to continue the Catholic sacraments. So it's not it's a question of their obligation. So that's what Lefebvre did. That's what Tooke did.
So knowing that they're lawful, ultimately judging each of the individual consecrations of Archbishop Tooke was not so much in your scope as the particular circumstances of the bishops you were concerned with cooperating with.
Yes.
So you're not necessarily maintaining that Archbishop Tooke was right in all of his episcopal consecrations, or that all of those. Do you buy the idea that if one of Archbishop Tooke's consecrations were questionable, then they're all questionable?
No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way it doesn't work that way in church law or moral theology. You know, it's there's the one issue of the consecrations that he performed; those were valid and those were licit, and the other issues are sort of distractions. Well, and the thing is that too, there could always be there's always the question of deception as well. People, certainly can deceive a bishop about their intentions, about who they are, about what they do, and you're not granted that particular the ability to sniff that out or to have that kind of insight just because you're a bishop yourself.
Yeah, I mean, some people, I mean, obviously the Archbishop's not here to defend himself, but some people have been very hard on him that, what kind of man would, consecrate or ordain such people? And so they really lay the blame at the foot of Archbishop Took that, he should have investigated, he should have known better. And I think it's very helpful to understand that Archbishop Took had murdered family members. He's abandoned in the church. He's not necessarily in a frame of mind where he has the resources necessarily to go and do a deep investigation into each candidate. And so,
well, let me tell you about the danger of judging on not too much information and judging from afar.
Well, it's easy to do.
It's easy to do. Sometimes it's even fun. Some people make it a hobby. But let me take one example. First of all, there's a fellow named George Musey. Now, I first ran into George Musey when I went down to help dedicate the SSPX church in Dickinson, Texas. And the superior of the church, then Father Hector Bolduc, said, let's go over and eat at this place just across the expressway. It's called Hofbrauhaus. It's really great. So we went over to eat there. And it was very German, very gemütlich, and they had an Oompa band and so on. So the owner came over, or the manager came over, and he asked if we were Catholic priests. And we said, yes, we're Catholic priests. He said, well, so am I. And he introduced himself as George Musey. And he was the priest of some diocese in Texas, but he was not functioning as a priest. And I didn't quite get the entire story as to why not. Well, several years later, I learned that George Musey, or Father Musey, had been, he began to function again as a priest, I think with Father Bolduc for a while in Dickinson. And eventually he became what would be called the sedevacantist, and he was consecrated a bishop by Bishop Carmona down in Mexico. And of course, this struck me as perfectly crazy. The guy is running in, has left the priesthood. He is running in a pretty good restaurant with an Oompa band, but normally that's not something that would be required by canon law for episcopal consecration. And here he shows up and he's a bishop. And so you think, well, all this is nuts, and you think that Carmona was nuts for consecrating him. Well, then you learn
So you didn't think about opening a restaurant?
No, and I love German food. So I thought this was perfectly crazy, but when you then the question is, there's the other side of the story, which I didn't realize at the time, that how Musey ended up as a bishop was that Bishop Carmona had a seminary. He had founded a seminary. He had been a seminary professor himself, and actually it turned out was a fairly widely respected priest in the Diocese of Acapulco, where he came from. But transient, he would take care of these traditionalist groups, very militant traditionalist groups in different parts of Mexico, where the traditionalists would take over churches, and Cristero style, and they would battle the local modernists and bring in priests who said the traditional mass. Well, Carmona went up to one of these places in the mountains to do confirmation, and he's coming down, and he was kidnapped. He's a bishop. He was kidnapped by banditos who had been hired by the Novus Ordo priest to kidnap him and to hold him, and unless the ransom was paid, to kill him. So it was after, eventually Carmona talked himself out of that, but it was after that he decided that I've got to find someone to consecrate a bishop, because these people are going to kill me. So because Musey lived in the United States and was a sedevacantist and was essentially just kind of on the other side of the border, he figured that this would be, good for him to do. So what happens is sometimes you don't get the whole story. And it changes your perspective, and it certainly changed my perspective about that. Before I thought it was nuts, but then if you're kidnapped and threatened with death, you've got a seminary and everything, you're going to want to make some provision for it.
And now you know the rest of the story.
As they would say, yes, as Paul Harvey would say.
Well, I never knew that whole German restaurant thing. I'm actually kind of hungry now, hearing it.
Yeah, well, it's Friday, so.
Yes, so that's when meat tastes best, actually. So, I think your point is well taken here, Father. That it's very easy to look and say, well, that person was, a notorious evildoer, and Archbishop Tooke should have seen that. Mm-hmm. But we weren't there. We weren't in the room. We weren't there to be told by this man who was seeking episcopal consecration, mm-hmm. whoever they may have been. And I think one of the great untold stories, and I think maybe perhaps it should remain untold because it's not the most exciting thing to hear about, is Archbishop Lefebvre too ordained some men who in ordinary times, some might argue, would probably not have been ordained.
Oh yeah, sure.
In the heady early days of traditionalism, there were measures taken that don't have to be taken now, as there are hundreds of priests, not only from the Society of St. Pius X, but other places, who are saying exclusively the traditional Mass, the traditional office.
Yes.
It's a different world now.
Indeed it is. Another thing about information when it comes to Tooke is, he was portrayed as basically as a crazy old geezer, and who didn't know who he was, what he was doing, etc., as like an automaton operating on autopilot or something like that. Well, the fact that after the initial consecrations he wrote out a certificate in Latin should disprove that in the mind of any reasonable man. But in terms of additional information that one eventually got about Tooke, there are many, many interesting things, and you run into people who actually heard Tooke and who knew him after he performed those consecrations. There's some priests that we work with in Mexico who were present at a conference that Tooke gave, and that was translated from French into Spanish in Mexico. And these priests were very, very impressed with him. There's another priest we came into contact with, Father Francis Miller, who actually lived with Tooke in Rochester, New York, for about a year and a half. Tooke had been brought over to the United States by the then Father Louis Vazelis.
And what time period would this have been approximately?
I'm not entirely sure on those dates.
Would this have been the 80s?
In the 80s, at some point in the 80s. So maybe 83 to 84. So Tooke actually lived with these people, and this Father Miller was then a student living with then Father Vazelis in Rochester, and he talks about, how he functioned normally, etc., joked, was a quiet and kind of a humble man, said, he had nice conversations with him, said Mass in a very devout way, and gives a completely different picture from the popular prejudice of someone who's an automaton who didn't know who he was or what he was doing. That's absurd, and that's something now we know from credible people who knew him. So
but that caricature serves some people's narratives.
Oh, of course it does. Yeah,
it's much more useful to think that way.
But yes, and don't confuse me with the facts. But I mean, these are all reasonable, credible people that you deal with. So in the point of view of trying to maintain that he was crazy or didn't know who. That's a pure prejudice and runs really against the reality of it. You know, as we learn by speaking with these different people.
So we've talked about the fact that the consecrations took place, that they were valid, that in the broader context. And Father, would you say it characterize that divine law supersedes canon law in times like this in the church?
Yeah, there's a there's an understanding of the hierarchy of laws, and the whole purpose of ecclesiastical law is to support and to promote the divine law. The salvation of souls is the whole purpose of ecclesiastical law. And if there's a provision, if an individual provision of ecclesiastical law is applied in such a way that it doesn't serve that purpose, or in fact it directly impedes that purpose, then it ceases to apply. It ceases to bind. And that's a general principle in church law that has to do with intrinsic cessation of law. That's the 25-cent term. With inflation, I suppose now the $10 term for it. But because it harms the salvation of souls, it ceases to apply.
So how are Catholics, now that those who've had a chance to see this, they're a bit more informed? There are some groups, I think of one in particular, it's really just confined to the United States, it's not really known internationally, but some groups just continue to avoid anybody having anything to do with toque line consecrations as filled with the plague. So I suppose how are we as Catholics supposed to deal with these facts now that we've been presented with them, and how can we deal with Catholics who don't want to be confused with the facts?
There's an element of donatism to it, that somehow the people in that particular frame of reference think that you're going to get sacramentally infected somehow. And it really doesn't work that way. The sacraments, their validity is independent of the moral qualities of the minister. And the sacrament is valid if you have correct matter, form, and intention. And the moral qualities of the minister really don't make any difference. So this is a type really of donatism. And it's really something that has to be rejected, from that point of view, that or a type of guilt by association. Yeah, and it's bad theology, and it's based on bad theology as well, because of the how simple really the prerequisites are for considering a sacrament to be valid. If you have a Catholic minister who performs confers a sacrament using a Catholic rite, it's automatically presumed to be valid. Some will try to construct, let's say, their own principles to say that you have to have someone who witnesses that the correct matter and form were applied before you can
see. Qualified witness.
He has to be qualified, yes. Be able to answer questions about that. But that's an absurdity. And having read myself through several sacramental theology sections, several libraries, it's an absurdity. No one says that. My question to anyone who claims that is, where is it written down? Give me a citation, please. I want to look it up myself. And of course they never can. They never can.
I know you're big on footnotes, Father, and that's not a bad thing. For those of our viewers who don't know what Donatism is, could you just kind of give a quick footnote?
It was a heresy that essentially maintained that if you had a heretical minister, that his sacrament, the sacraments that he conferred, were invalid. And that those who had received baptism, let us say, from a heretical minister had to be rebaptized.
So somehow that their loss in holiness had removed their sacramental character.
Precisely, or removed their ability to confer, even more than that, to confer a sacrament validly. But if that were the case, you would never know whether or not a sacrament you were receiving was valid. It would make no sense. the whole sacramental economy would be open to question, would have to go out the window. So too, it would all go out the window if you had to have qualified witnesses to every sacrament, because we're doing a baptism this coming Sunday, and so would one have to have two people present who could attest to the fact that Father Larrabee correctly pronounced the form Ego te baptizo nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. However, then the question is, what about the hearing of the two witnesses? That would have to be tested as well. So it's sort of a rabbit hole, and then when you get to the water, heaven help us, because you'd have to have chemists, but then you'd have to be sure that the knowledge of the chemists was qualified, and that those in turn who had tested them for their qualifications in chemistry to determine whether you had hydrogen and water, whether or not that was the case.
Well, then
so
it's
the rabbit
hole. Working for the Freemasons. Also,
precisely.
I mean, this is a further issue. Well, and Mr. Dirksen makes the point, much more viscerally for me, that I certainly don't want to meet qualified witnesses in the confessional.
Certainly not.
So
I hadn't thought of that one, but that's a pretty good one. That he's a German, so he's covering, Stephen. He's covering all those bases.
we must be very complete.
Jawohl.
Well, I think. In sort of summary, Father, if it may have been predicted early on that as time goes on, more and more people will doubt the two consecrations, I think actually the reverse has been true. And I think Mr. Dirksen makes this point as well in his letter, that over time, frankly, it's been completely the opposite. As the facts, as you point out, as the facts have come out and we've had more personal testimony to clamp onto the actual look it up facts, more and more people accept it.
Sure.
Just as valid and true.
Yes.
Thanks so much for your time today, Father.
Thank you very much.